Solution to an African problem, tackling the ongoing illegal trade of ivory. 4 southern African countries are considering breaking away from the United Nations Conventions on International Trade in Endangered Species. Why? Well, to save our elephants. The ivory trade continues to decimate numbers, and we need them. They're not only our heritage, but also a massive income generator for the country. Let's find out how it'll work with legal and CITES expert Derek Lewiton. Long time since I last spoke to you, Derek. Update us on these moves to break away from the UN here.
So it's really just 4 countries exploring their options in terms of the trade they feel is required to sustain their conservation efforts. These are countries that have done a tremendous job of elephant conservation, but they're struggling to pay that bill. There aren't really very good funding mechanisms, and their populations have exceeded the carrying capacity of the land that's been set aside. And they need funding to help manage this now, to keep their elephants safe and to continue providing additional habitat for those populations. So they're really just exploring their departure.
Sorry, Derek, we lost you there for a minute. Okay, tell us how it's going to work and how reluctant will the UN be to let this go? I mean, I know there's been a long-going challenge to having African solutions for African problems, African issues. Is this the solution?
Well, I think it's the beginning of finding a solution. I don't think these countries likely will end up leaving CITES. I think what they're largely doing now is making clear their dissatisfaction. I think in the end, what will happen is that CITES will dispatch some expertise down to Southern Africa to help the SADC countries understand that CITES is not an actual obstacle to this trade. They have it within their power to establish multilateral relationships with buying nations and regulate the trade responsibly. And I suspect that's what they'll end up doing.
And how do you get that balance between, I mean, they're 2 such opposing camps, aren't there? Those that say you should trade in the ivory to save the elephants and put money back to the community, and others say, well, that's sacrosanct, it should absolutely not happen.
I think where we're all united is that we all want what's best for conservation. Nobody gets into this space unless you truly love the animals, although we end up having some pretty vicious fights about how best to go about saving them. But in the end, what you find is armchair Western, largely, conservation approaches and real-world African conservation approaches. And if you look at what's worked is the African approach. You look, and specifically the Southern African approach. If you look into Central and North Africa, creatures like ostriches and giraffes are almost extinct and in dire need of protection, whereas here in South Africa, they are plentiful, abundant. The solutions that have worked have been largely driven by commercial enterprise. And we can love that or we can hate it, but I think at this point we have to recognize the truth of it. And these countries are simply saying, we have done a great job of protecting elephants. We have hundreds of thousands of elephants. Poaching is not a risk in these countries to elephants' long-term health. It's habitat. It's being able to provide and protect safe habitat. And that's a financial issue. So they're looking for a solution to the financial shortfalls. And I think this is in the end inevitable and laudable. And I think what we're also seeing is that there is a consensus across Southern Africa that this is the way to go, excluding all of a sudden South Africa. For decades, South Africa was a leader in this space, both in terms of overall conservation and success, but also in the thinking about how to best leverage commercial enterprise for conservation outcomes. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is South Africa losing that standing, and especially with the minister's most recent report, the rest of SADC saying, look, we're all on the same page together. If you're not with us, then we'll act without you. I think the most interesting thing here is not that these SADC countries are flexing their muscles against CITES. It's that they're doing so without South Africa.
All right, and tell us about the role that communities play in all of this, the move to make this work from the ground up.
Well, I think that's the great thing, the great unspoken or undiscussed issue. It started in the last few years to get more airtime, but historically, the communities that have to sacrifice for conservation to take place have been marginalized, they've been ignored, they've been trampled on, and they're only in the last decade or so starting to really get their voice. And you're seeing some very thoughtful and articulate arguments coming out of Namibia in particular, and coming out of Botswana about the need for the communities that were displaced to create these parks, and whose land lies adjacent to these parks, the communities that bear the brunt of elephants who have grown in population terms well beyond the carrying capacity of the parks, and who are now expanding into land that is still held by these communities. And there are human fatalities as a result of this conflict, and these communities are starting to speak up, and now, very importantly, starting to be heard. And they're saying, look, we want to conserve these animals, but we need it to be workable. We need there to be a revenue stream that helps us protect our people, our livelihoods. There needs to be a revenue stream that makes it worthwhile putting up with the risk and the difficulties. And it is very risky. I can tell you, on my reserve up in Limpopo, we don't have elephants because we're focused on protecting rhino, and we've got several hundred rhino, and elephants are a risk to the rangers and the rhino, and so we don't have them. But occasionally they break out of neighboring reserves, and knowing just as you're driving along those roads that there are elephants wandering them that are not in the best of moods, it's a little scary. Now imagine if you're living adjacent to these parks and there's nothing to stop the elephants from coming and raiding the crops that you rely upon, nothing to protect your children as they walk to school. These communities have to be heard if we're going to take conservation seriously.
I do. Derek, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
A group of